OCI Orange County Inspections is very glad to present the following: the Quality Control and Quality Assurance Professional Seminar, segment number 12. Within this segment, we will cover sheet metal welding, and the following topics will be covered. First is the qualification. We will see there are certain welding processes that are used with certain types of joints, which have been tested and have shown to satisfy the code requirements. But there are times when certain joints need to be proposed, and they are then subject to the testing provisions of the code, which then the obligation is placed on the contractor to prepare and qualify them before production is started. Second topic is the fabrication, which defines the ability of welding sheet metal like such items as steel decking, panels, storage racks, and stud or joist framing members, while enforcing the proper techniques and code compliance requirements so to produce sound weld joints. Last topic is the observation. Although the code is vital in guiding the assembly of the weld joint, there is still the need for observation during the production phase. By this performance, it will verify the quality of the weld has been performed as per the code specifications. The first topic we will review is the qualification used for sheet metal welding. The welding of sheet metal through the years developed many procedures and techniques which created the first code edition in 1978. As the code was being established, it was well known that changes would take place throughout the coming years dealing with the welded joints because of greater experience with using the code and also researching the test results by the American Iron and Steel Institute subcommittee. The scope covers the arc welding of structural sheet strip steels that include cold forming members with a thickness of 3/16 inch and less. When sheet steel members are joined to material 1/8 inch and thicker by welding, Annex A must be reviewed for conformance. This table covers electrodes, types of weld joints, the design of welded connection, pre-qualified WPSs, qualification tests for both the procedure and welder, preheat and interpass temperatures, fabrication procedures, visual inspection of weld profile, and lastly, stud welding, while also working with the requirements of D11. The following welding processes are approved, which means there is no test qualification required if used as per the manufacturer recommendation, and they are shielded metal arc welding, gas tungsten arc welding, flux core arc welding, gas metal arc welding, and with this process, all the modes of transfer are allowed. Yes, even short-circuiting transfer mode. The electrode for shielded metal arc welding process shall conform to the AWS A5.1 specification for carbon steel electrodes and the AWS A5.5 specification for low alloy steel. Now, if any other electrode specification is needed to be used, it must be approved by establishing a PQR. The following weld types are approved: the square groove in a butt joint, fillet welds in a lap or T-joint, flare groove, arc spot, arc seam, and arc plug. The way to match the correct filler metal with the base metal being used is found in Table 1.2. Here we see the AWS Table 1.2, and we will take a closer look at this section of the table. The QC and QA professional needs to understand that these two parts of the table must work together for finding the correct information. So first is the grouping callout. And with the closer look, you see we are in group number 2, which is how the base metal is sometimes referred to. Next, we see the actual base metal specification plus the grade for this group 2. Now a quick tip. You might have seen the same base metal found in another grouping, but slow down and check the grade, which will be different. Next is the two areas that cover the minimum yield point, providing the KSI, which means kips square inch, and the MPa, megapascals, numbers. And then the minimum tensile strength, also providing the KSI and megapascal numbers. And lastly is the filler metal specification and classification that is approved to be used with the base metal within this group 2. Now let's cover some minimum and maximum for welding of sheet metal. First is the minimum length for a fillet, flare bevel, and flare V groove weld, which is 3/4 of an inch. Second is the minimum leg length of a fillet weld for a lap joint or T-joint, which is the thickness of the thinnest material used. Third is the minimum fusion surface of an arc spot and plug weld, which is 3/8 of an inch. Fourth are the weld washers, which should be within 0.05 to 0.08 thickness. Fifth is the minimum width of an arc seam weld, which is 3/8 of an inch. As we covered earlier in the seminar, a pre-qualified WPS is a written living document that includes the recorded values for each variable approved by the D1.3 code that will produce a sound weld assembly. Now, when the contractor does this, it's defined as exempt from a qualification test as long as the assembly is between sheet steel to sheet steel or sheet steel to a structural member equal or less than 3/16 inch in thickness. And if any deviation from the joint details approved by the AWS committee happens, this will have the proposed WPS needing engineer approval before production can begin. Here we see a pre-approved joint detail provided by the AWS D1.3 code, and to satisfy the code requirements of a pre-qualified WPS, remember this detail must be followed to the letter, or if any deviations take place, it will make a qualification test needed for the WPS. Now let's take a closer look at the figure. First is the welding processes that are able to be used with this detail, and you see all the approved processes are allowed. But remember, only the approved processes by the code. Next is the material thickness range that is allowed, and the biggest thing is the symbols used to designate the two different plates, the T1 and the T2. We move over to the dimension of the root opening that are allowed, and once again we see the symbol used to represent the root opening. And last column is the welding positions allowed. Can you name all 4 positions? They are flat, horizontal, vertical, overhead. So, how'd you do? Now we see, even using a small detail like this, you must be heads up for any notes provided. And we close with the actual figure heading, which we see the numbers of 3.2.2 in parentheses. And this refers you back for a better explanation within the code for this joint detail. Okay, we just reviewed the pre-qualified WPS, but remember, even with sheet steel, there are the PQR and WPS qualified by testing. Once again, the WPS qualified by testing is a written living document for each type of weld, which must comply with the AWS D1.3 code requirements, plus be accepted by the engineer of record. And the PQR is also a written living document that records the actual values used to establish the WPS qualified by testing. Another quick tip: the melting rate data of a shielded metal arc welding electrode that is provided in the D1.3 code commentary may be used as a measure of welding current for both the WPS and PQR. Table 4.2 of the D1.3 covers the PQR essential variable changes. We have seen this table format in the segment for the D11, and the meaning is the same, which is, if any deviations take the parameters of a pre-qualified or a qualified by testing WPS out of the table's tolerance that are allowed, it will be needed to be re-qualified. This is a typical term confused with the qualification test. Remember, the qualification test is for the weld assembly, where the welder performance qualification is for the actual personnel. This qualification will establish the following with the welder: the welding process, electrode grouping, welding position or positions, direction of welding, and any specified conditions. Plus, the performance test has the welder satisfying a number of tests and methods that, once passed, will be considered remaining in effect indefinitely unless inactive for more than 6 months or a reason for concern with the welder's ability is raised. Here we review a test assembly for the welder's performance qualification. And we once again see the code call out for more information within the code found in the heading. Next, we see the actual configuration of the test assembly used. And here's the actual title for the joint assembly used. The type of destructive test required for qualification. Here are 2 columns within this one section for positions. And if the welder tested in the vertical position, that will qualify the welder to weld in the flat, horizontal, and vertical positions during production welding. And lastly is the type of weld joint and thickness ranges the welder is qualified to perform production welding. We move into the second topic of this segment, and that is the fabrication for welding of sheet steel, with the first item covering the adequate weather protection during production welding. This one item includes the ambient air temperature, not to mention the base metal, plus the wind speed during the welding when gas metal and gas tungsten arc welding, plus flux core arc welding when using gas shielding processes are used. Base metal surfaces are next, which should be free and smooth of cracks, tears, etc. that could affect the quality of the weld assembly. The third item is the joint, which should be arranged for the most favorable positions to weld. That includes the base metal being brought together as close as possible for complete fusion. And lastly, another quick tip is if the backing material satisfies ASTM A109 temper 3 or 4, it can be used without a qualification test. And lastly is the third topic of this segment, which is the observation of the welding for sheet steel. First item is the acceptance criteria of the production welding, which covers the visual observation of the preparation, fit-up, and welding of the weld assembly, with issues as no cracks are allowed, no evidence of lack of fusion between the base metals, proper reinforcement height, correct accumulation of undercut, proper weld face shape, and compliance with approved documentation for location, size, and length of weld. Next is the contractor's responsibility, which includes the proper approved WPS, whether pre-qualified or qualified by tests, plus welder qualification, and providing access to the work area with safe conditions. And lastly is the work itself. At any time during welding, a request of electrode melt rate, wire feed rate, or welding current can be compared to the approved WPS, and if the quality of the welder's work is judged to be below the requirements of the specification or code, a requalification of the welder can be requested. But before we finish, another quick tip is that the arc spot and seam welds are commonly used for attaching metal decking to thicker structural members, and the age-old question is often asked: is preheat required for the structural member if the D11 code requires it? Some research studies on this issue have stated that preheat is generally not used, but please check with your design professional for their direction on this matter. We have come to the end of segment number 12, and let's review the topics we covered. Number 1 was a qualification. In terms of welds, we covered the technique and methods that can be used, plus how it's possible any electrode can produce a weld, but the proper specification and classification that are stated by the code is needed for proper penetration and lessen undercutting with the sheet steel material. Next, we uncovered the pre-qualified weld joints that take the calculation of the behavior of a certain weld joint out of our untrained and certified hands that lead us to make sure we have compliance with the essential variable limitation table. Fabrication was the second item, which alerted us to the position of the joint detail and the ASTM A109 backing material that requires no qualification test, plus realizing the welding positions of flat, horizontal, vertical, and overhead are the same as per the D11 code. And lastly, number 3 was the observation of the welding for sheet steel, which brought to our attention the proper preparation, like smooth surfaces, then the proper fit-up of the base metal, while closing with proper welding, like the current being in compliance with the approved WPS at all times during the production. Well, we have reached the study material for this segment, and you will be reading some very fine guides dealing with sheet steel. First is a safety guide dealing with the very dangerous fumes that are put off during welding. Next is the welding of galvanized steel, while finishing with the SDI manual for construction with steel deck. If any questions arise, just email orangecountyinspections@yahoo.com. When completed, move to segment number 13.